Welcome to the ACIT Science Podcast, the official podcast of the Association for Critical and Interdisciplinary Thinking. We are a global nonprofit organization dedicated to spreading education around artificial intelligence, neuroscience, and social change. In this podcast, we are hoping to provide insightful discussions with young professionals and world-leading researchers alike. I'm your host, Manuel Brenner, and now without any further ado, let's jump right in. So hi everyone, welcome to the ACIT Science Podcast. I'm here with Jonathan Banks. I'll jump in with a short intro on your background. You are Global Director of the Super Pollutants program for the Clean Air Task Force, where you develop and direct the Clean Air Task Force international efforts to dramatically reduce methane pollution, both from the energy sector, but also from agriculture. And you previously haven't always worked in methane, but you led a national environmental campaign working to clean up coal-fired plants, which is also something the Clean Air Task Force has originally worked on. Again, as a reminder, this is part 4 of our mini-series with the Clean Air Task Force, and we've had previous discussions with Armand Cohen, the director, and about carbon storage and capture and nuclear energy. So there's a lot of interesting conversations that already happened, but now we can properly tackle methane, as Liebeck suggested in a previous episode, that this is too interesting to not talk about on our podcast. So maybe as a general icebreaker question, what brought you to the Clean Air Task Force, or maybe what is your professional background more generally, and kind of your way, how did you find your way into the methane topic?
Well, I've been with the Clean Air Task Force for a very long time, in some form or fashion. I've been here for over 22 years. I started working with CATF in 1999 when I was hired to. I was working in the U.S. Congress on environment and energy issues, and I was hired to head up efforts to push for legislation that would clean up power plants in the United States. Over time, my role within CATF evolved quite a bit. But in the early 2000s, 2002 to be precise, the first study on short-lived climate pollutants, methane, black carbon, HFCs, those types of pollutants, the first study on those pollutants emerged, and CATF began to explore how we could leverage reductions in those kinds of pollutants to provide a greater benefit to climate mitigation. And so I started working more and more on that project starting in the early 2000s, and I've been full-time working on this issue for, since about 2006, 2007.
So you worked on methane and super pollutants since 2006.
Yeah.
I guess there's been a big shift in also perception of like a wider audience of people, and I think the climate programs in general about methane. When do you think there was a significant shift in the last couple of years?
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, the first science on this came out in the early 2000s, and it's taken a long time for people to understand both the impact of methane as well as the opportunity that methane presents. And I'll say a little bit about that first. The impact, methane is what we call a short-lived climate pollutant. So it has a short life in the atmosphere, but it has a very intense life in the atmosphere. So while it's in the atmosphere for about 2 decades, it is super powerful in heating up the planet. It's over 80 times more powerful molecule per molecule compared to CO2. Now, CO2 lasts for, sometimes, hundreds and hundreds of years in the atmosphere and keeps having an impact on the atmosphere for all of that time. Methane only lasts for a couple of decades, but it has a really intense couple of decades that it's impacting the planet. That short life and that dramatic impact on the climate is also the opportunity that these kinds of pollutants present. if we can reduce those emissions, we can have a dramatic impact on climate change in a very near term. If we reduce CO2 today, we won't see the benefits of that for a while. It will take, decades and decades and decades before we start to see the impacts of CO2 reductions we make today. And we have to do those. But with methane, we can start to bend the curve on climate in the near term, in our lifetimes. In the next 2 decades, if we are to cut emissions today by 40%, we could see a reduction in global warming within the next 2 decades of 0.3 degrees Celsius. And so that's the opportunity that's huge in the climate space. When you're talking about 1 degree of current warming, 0.3 degrees of temperature change is enormous. In the last 2 years, the world, the governments, the companies, other NGOs have really finally come around to this issue. And they've seen, both the dramatic impact of methane emissions to climate change, but also this opportunity, this hope that methane puts out there, that we can actually have, a benefit to climate change in our lifetime. There was a couple of big pieces of research that came out in the last couple of years. One was a piece of research done by the United Nations Environment Program, the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, and a number of scientists from around the world. That piece was called the Global Methane Assessment, which looked at the impact of methane, but also if we take certain actions, what would be the impact of climate change, public health, and other things. That had a really big impact in driving policymakers forward. Then early in the spring of last year, or I guess it was over the summer of last year, the IPCC released its what's known as AR6, which is their big annual climate assessment. And AR6 had a big piece in there on methane's impact of climate change and what reductions in methane could mean for climate. And all that science fed into policymakers coming together over the course of last year, led by the United States, the European Union, and the UK government, coming together to bring countries to the table for what became known as the Global Methane Pledge, which was launched at COP26 in Glasgow. The Global Methane Pledge is currently 111 countries who've come together to collectively pledge to reduce methane emissions from all sources by 30% by 2030, which would have a huge impact in reducing global warming in our lifetime. And so, there's while it took a long time to get to this point where we're at, we're seeing a whole lot of momentum moving forward, and we're looking to capitalize on that momentum to really get strong policies in place around the world to cut methane emissions.
I think one of the main developments in the methane sector was to even realize that there is a problem, because historically, from what I gathered, the methane emissions have been widely underestimated and have actually been increasing in recent years. So maybe we can start by discussing where methane actually comes from and where it is produced and why it is so difficult to actually estimate how many emissions there are.
Yeah, so methane has, at the highest level, there's two main sources. There's natural sources, so you get methane from wetlands and things like that. And then there's human sources. We don't tend to focus much on the natural sources because that's a bit more you're not going to stop wetlands from creating methane. So we tend to focus all on the what's known as anthropogenic methane, human-caused methane. Within the anthropogenic methane, you have a few key sources. There are fossil fuels, so oil, coal, gas, all of those have methane emissions associated with the production of the fuel, as well as in the case of natural gas, the transmission of that fuel. So as you move natural gas around the world, there's methane emissions associated with that movement of natural gas, because natural gas is basically methane. It's 90 to 95% methane. So anytime natural gas leaks out of a pipe, you have methane emissions. The other big sources of methane emissions are agriculture. And within agriculture, there's a lot of different methane sources. One of the bigger ones comes from the livestock sector. So cows, you can have methane emissions from the manure that cows create. You can have methane emissions from the burps that the cows emit through a process of enteric fermentation, so fermentation inside of the cows' bellies. And then you can also, within agriculture, you can have emissions from the rice sector or other agriculture sectors, where you have methane being emitted from those areas. And then there's other methane sources are in the waste sector, so from landfills or wastewater treatment facilities. Both of those are the other big sources of methane emissions. So it really comes down to fossil fuels, agriculture, and the waste sector. Those are the three really big sectors. But within each of those, there's smaller elements that are very focused on different elements within the sectors.
So in which of these sectors would you say is it most straightforward to actually tackle methane reduction? Because I feel like it has mainly focused on the oil and gas sector and not so much on the others.
Yeah, to date, most of the work has focused on the oil and gas sector for that very reason. I often refer to the types of things that we have to do in the oil and gas sector it's not rocket science, it's plumbing. That's an oversimplification, but it really is a lot of that. It's not dramatic increases in our technological ability, or the need for some new gadget to be able to fix this. This is good maintenance, good practices, and just forcing companies to do the things that they should be doing already. And so it's definitely the space where it is the easiest to do and also the most economic to do. You think about the natural gas sector, again, methane is natural gas is methane. If I fix a problem in a pipeline, that means I'm losing less of my product. So I literally am saving myself money. And so the economics are really good in the oil and gas sector. And the solutions are really quite simple. So that's definitely the space where people have been focused in the early days of the methane discussions. But within all of the sectors, there is a huge opportunity for very inexpensive and often very economic and sometimes profitable reductions, because of what you're often doing in the methane space has other benefits, has other co-benefits. So if I capture methane from a manure pile at a cattle farm, I can often, through the collection process, I can often use the methane that I'm capturing there for local power, to power, things on the farm. You can also, in a bigger facility, you can often collect that and actually turn it into biomethane. So there's often lots of economic benefits that throughout the system that exist. In the waste sector at a landfill site, you can capture landfill gas and use it to power the trash collection trucks or local power facilities at the landfill. So the economics are good throughout the space, but definitely the oil and gas sector is the area where most attention has been paid because the economics are so good, especially with the price of energy. Currently, almost everything you would do in the oil and gas sector is profitable.
So, on what basically scale are these leaks that you would expect then? Because I think it becomes more profitable for them if there's like 5% of the methane leaking, but if it's only down to very small margins, then it doesn't become as profitable anymore. So, is there actually such a large amount of leakage? So, just to get some feeling for the numbers here.
Yeah, no, there is a lot of gas that is leaked, and it depends, you know, what part of the world you're looking at, what part of each country you're looking at. Within each country, you have areas of the country that are often leaking more than other areas. You have companies that place a higher priority on methane mitigation than other companies, and so you can have quite a diversity of emissions within a country. But methane is methane mitigation in the oil and gas sector is extremely profitable, extremely economic. It's the cheapest thing we can do on climate change, period. And even for the smaller leaks, at an oil and gas site, you might have, let's say you have 50 sources on an oil and gas site that could be leaking or maybe are leaking. Some are leaking a lot and some are leaking just a little. The cost of finding those leaks and fixing those leaks, a lot of that cost is the cost of actually going out and looking for them. So sending a team out there and looking for them. Once you've sent a team out there to look for the leaks and you've found, oh my goodness, there's this big leak over here. Well, of course we're going to fix this. You might as well fix the small leaks while you're there, because the cost of fixing the benefit of fixing the big leak will offset the fact that you've already found these small leaks too. If all you do is go out there and look and find the small leaks, those small leaks might not be as beneficial to fix, but over the course of looking at your entire system, the big leaks will pay for the small leaks and you'll still be in a very profitable space.
So yeah, focusing in on this issue of finding the leaks, what are kind of the technological opportunities we have there, and maybe connecting that to the work the Clean Air Task Force has done in exposing a lot of these unknown leaks.
Yeah, that's another aspect of methane is it's invisible, which has led to some of the issues of people not paying attention to it for so long. If you are behind a diesel truck, you see the pollution. There's nothing you can do to avoid that pollution. You see it, you smell it. Same thing for a coal-fired power plant. You see that pollution coming off the plant. There's no hiding from that. If you walk by a gas facility, you'll have no idea whether methane is coming out of that gas facility. You can't see it until it gets pretty far down the line, usually into the city. It doesn't have a smell. And unless it's a really, really massive leak, you will not hear it either. And so that creates a problem in finding these emissions. But technology has been created to enable us to see methane. And there's a special kind of camera. It's called an optical gas imaging camera. It looks like an old video camera, from the 1980s, really, but it's a very fancy 1980s video camera. And you turn this thing on, and all of a sudden you can see the methane emissions. It's truly an amazing experience to see this. You can scan an entire facility in a matter of a short amount of time, depending on the size of the facility. And it allows you to see, small leaks, big leaks, everything in between. And we have a team of folks who are trained with this technology and have been running around Europe mostly over the last couple of years, documenting methane emissions in Europe. And what we've, one of the things we're trying to do is to show that there's this problem, that it exists. We're trying to show policymakers in Europe there's a problem here. We need policy to address this problem. It's not a problem of gas in Russia or gas in Algeria. It's a problem in Europe, and it demands a European solution. So we've been documenting emission sources throughout Europe. We've been to, I think, 14 different countries within the EU to date, documenting emissions at about 60% of the sites that we've visited. Many emissions that were quite large emissions at places that I would honestly never have expected to see emissions. Places like LNG import terminals or large gas storage facilities, places where companies have spent a lot of money to get the gas to those points, and you wouldn't expect to be seeing large emission sources coming out of them since they're wasting their own product. So what we've been doing is documenting those emissions and then publicizing them and talking with policymakers, talking with other stakeholders to try to foster an environment where the European government institutions will be pushing forward with policies to address this. And it's not the only thing that's led to this, but our work was definitely a contributing factor in the legislation that has come out of the European Commission and that now sits with the European Parliament and the European Council that will be debated over the course of this year and into next year.
Yeah, so now that we are at the policy level, the European methane strategy that you just mentioned is connected to this global methane pledge. So can you talk a little bit about what the ambition here is and how far the policies actually are at the EU level?
Yes. So the EU policy development started about almost 2 years ago with the European Commission really doing a lot of investigation into the issue of methane, the issue of what they could do, the different solutions, different policy solutions. And culminated with the issuance of a methane strategy by the European Commission, and then eventually draft legislation at the end of last year that was sent to Parliament and the Council. The legislation builds off of work that's been done around the world. There are a number of other countries and subnational governments that have taken action on methane emissions, and the European Commission's work pulls from all of that work that's been done over the years, going back to, the earliest policies that were put in place, back in like 2014. And so it pulls from all of that to create a policy for Europe. But while Europe's not a major producer of natural gas, it does purchase more gas than on the globally traded gas than any other entity in the world. And so Europe pulls gas from all sorts of places around the world. Prior to the Ukraine war, it was Russia, Algeria, Qatar, and Norway were the big suppliers of Russian gas. That, of course, is in the process of being completely turned on its head. But Europe, beyond those big suppliers, Europe's buying gas from throughout Africa and from the United States and other parts of the Americas. So Europe touches on a lot of natural gas production on a global basis. And the Global Methane Pledge and Europe's strategy on cutting domestic emissions are tied together. Europe very much sees the need to do something about its domestic emissions while it pushes for international action on methane as well. And I think this is a really important thing because Europe can't run around the world saying to Nigeria, hey, you should really clean up your methane emissions, if it's not willing to do the same thing. And so the legislation that is moving through the European process right now is that first step to do that cleanup of the domestic emissions. There is an element to the legislation that's also tied to international, to all the gas that Europe imports into the EU, that starts to look at what they could do to reduce, to try to incentivize, to try to require reductions in emissions from the gas that they're buying from Algeria or the US or wherever. And just today, Europe released its Repower EU policy, which is how it plans to transition off of Russian gas. And within that Repower EU proposal, there is a piece that they call you collect, we buy. So as part of diversifying Europe's energy sources, its natural gas sources, they are proposing a program that will help incentivize the capturing of natural gas that's currently being flared or natural gas that's currently being vented. And those projects will supply much needed energy to Europe, but they'll also be a huge win on climate change because you're reducing the flaring and the methane emissions that are associated with that. And so it's a big win-win on climate change. And it begins to spread better practices around the world in a way that's beneficial to the country, to both the country selling the gas as well as to the European Union. And I think that will also help pave the way for standards that Europe will put in place eventually to require methane as part of the gas purchasing that they do.
So maybe to quickly clear up these two terms that you mentioned, flaring and venting. So what are these practices and why do they cause?
Yeah. So within this space, there's actually three terms there that we use: flaring, venting, and then the third one you'll hear people say leaks or fugitive emissions. I'm trying to think. Leaks or fugitive emissions. So flaring is the burning of natural gas, and so it's typically done at a site where in the best cases, it's being done extremely temporarily to flare gas in an emergency. So there's a problem, they have to release gas from a site. It's a very temporary thing, and rather than letting the gas go straight to the atmosphere, they flare it, they burn it, because that is less impactful to the climate, because it takes the gas and turns it from methane, which has over 80 times more impact than CO2 to the atmosphere. It turns it from methane into CO2. If you just let that gas go straight to the atmosphere, that's venting. And then leaks or fugitives, those are things that shouldn't be happening. The first two categories, companies are choosing to let those happen. Leaks and fugitive emissions are things where there's an accident or a piece of equipment is malfunctioning. And so those are things that shouldn't be happening. So those are kind of the three different terms there.
So from what I read, there's also ways to actually observe methane emissions from space via satellites. I'm not sure how much these technologies can actually help get like a global infrastructure for methane emissions.
Yes, this. I started earlier. I said methane is not rocket science; it's plumbing. With the exception of this, it is rocket science.
Yeah.
So this is the really exciting space here. Again, methane being invisible and having been largely ignored globally, we don't have the best data on, how much methane is coming from, Texas or Algeria or Russia. We don't have, we have estimates. In some places, we have really good data. In other places, we have horrible data. But the satellites promise to greatly increase our understanding of the total amount of methane emissions that are coming out of any given area. There are a number of satellites that are already up that are giving us little views here and there into large methane sources. A large pipeline leak in Azerbaijan, a large emission source outside of Buenos Aires at a landfill. We're seeing small little snapshots. That is just the very tip of the iceberg of what this technology is about to deliver in the next 2 years. There's a couple of big satellite programs that are about to launch in about a year and a half, 2 years, that are specific methane satellites that will cover most of the globe's oil and gas infrastructure, and also start to look at other sources of methane as well, and provide us extremely up-to-date data on a regular basis of emissions that will dramatically change the perception of where the problem is, and allow us to begin to target our engagements based on an improved amount of data. It will give a lot more confidence to policymakers, to companies, to countries, to civil society. Will be able to implement, a policy in Europe that says, look, if you're going to send gas to Europe, you have to meet a certain threshold for methane emissions, and you can pick that threshold, and then you would be able to verify. You'd have reports from the country or the company as to what they were emitting, but you'd also be able to verify that with the satellites. And so that provides a greater level of confidence that we're actually achieving what we've set out to do. So I think it's going to be a huge change in how in how we approach this issue. It will take away some of the biggest barriers we face when we start to try to have discussions with countries about what they could do to reduce their methane emissions. The first thing when I sit down with a country, the first thing they say to me is, "We have no idea how much we're emitting." And we have to get over that hurdle with them to get them to the point where they're talking about what they could do to actually reduce the methane emissions. The satellites hold out the promise that that barrier won't exist anymore, that we'll have a decent understanding of what those methane emissions will be.
And from what you talked about, it's really in the methane space surprisingly well-aligned incentives when it comes to you tell a certain country that they have these emissions that they might not even know about, and then because you can capture the methane and sell it, then it's actually profitable for everyone.
Yes, it's one of the few climate issues where you get to say things like that. In most of everything else on climate, what you're talking about is like, hey, I really want you to spend, $12 billion on this, and it won't be profitable, but it will be, very beneficial to the climate. This is one of those areas where what we're asking people to do is very, very often profitable to them, especially in today's energy prices. In today's energy prices, with what natural gas is selling for, nearly everything you would do in the oil and gas space is profitable. The next question you should ask is, why aren't they doing it anyways?
Yeah.
And that is a really good question. And the answer is that within the oil and gas sector, there are a number of barriers that companies face that have historically prevented them from doing what they should be doing. Sometimes, if you own the pipeline, you don't own the gas that's going through the pipeline. And the contract that you've negotiated with me, and I own the gas, allows you a certain loss of gas before you get in trouble with me. And anything that's under that loss, you don't really care about, because you don't make a benefit by capturing more of it. And you just have to make sure that it doesn't get any higher than that one loss, the loss factor that you negotiated in the contract. So there's no benefit to you in that case. In other cases, there in some countries where there's national oil companies, sometimes the national oil company will get its operating budget from the government, and if every molecule of gas that they sell, the profit goes to the government, and then the government gives the company an operating budget. If they capture methane from a leak or a vent or a flare, the profit from that project goes to the government, and the company never sees the profit. So there's no incentive for them to do it. They've lost the economic incentive to do this. And so there's things like this throughout the system. I mean, there's a laundry list of things that these barriers that lead to companies not taking action. And what we've found is one of the only ways to overcome these barriers is through policy action. And that's where things like the European methane strategy and the European legislation come into play. These are things where the government is saying, look, this isn't going to hurt you. It's going to be profitable, but you still have to do it. And that is when we see action. Another big barrier that we see, I should have mentioned, is within a company. If if you work in the division that drills new wells, and I work in the methane division that's supposed to be cleaning up methane leaks, you and I both have to fight over the available capital for new programs within the company. And while my project is profitable, your project might be more profitable. And so you get the capital and I don't get the capital. And so when you have policy at the government level, then my program suddenly is absolutely necessary. And so then I get the capital within the program. It's still profitable, but it's not as profitable as what you might have been proposing. But now the company's required to do it.
As solutions, you already mentioned what the European Union is doing by basically putting certain methane limits on countries they buy from. But there have also been obviously developments in the US and in other countries. I saw you work together with Colombia, for example. So what are more concrete measures that governments are taking to really tackle this issue?
Yeah, there's a number of countries have been taking action. In the US, at the subnational level, at the state level, there's a number of states that have been working on this issue for many, many years. And also at the federal level, the federal government is developing a new set of policies right now to address methane emissions. Canada has a set of policies in place and is in the process of developing stronger policies as well. Mexico also has a set of policies in place. Colombia, Nigeria is in the final stages of developing policies to address methane. Same with Ecuador. Argentina's been exploring these issues and there's a piece of legislation in the Argentine Senate to address methane emissions. So a number of countries have been looking at this. The process that they typically take, and each country is different, but the process that they typically take is to do a couple of things. One, they require what's known as leak detection and repair. So this is going out with the camera that we use or a similar kind of technology, looking for leaks and fixing them. Most of those leaks can be fixed on the same day that you find them, because sometimes it's little simple things like closing a valve or closing a hatch on a tank. So they're really most of the things that you would do are really, really simple fixes. So first thing is a leak detection repair program, and how often you do it depends on how much reduction you will get in leaks. The more you do it, the deeper reduction you get in leaks. The other thing that countries tend to focus on is replacing equipment, old pieces of equipment that are, by their design, emissions come out of them. There's pieces of equipment throughout the oil and gas sector that, when they were originally designed, they were designed to operate on the pressure of the gas in the system. And so when they open and close, they release puffs of gas, or some cases they release much bigger amounts of gas. And so countries tend to focus on requiring replacement of those kinds of equipment with modern equipment that doesn't leak. And then, the final piece that countries tend to focus on is, reducing the amount of flaring that's happening and the amount of venting. And so they typically will be putting in, standards for the few exceptions for when it's okay to vent, those emergency situations, but they define those emergencies so that companies aren't taking advantage of it. At a high level, that's basically what countries are doing to, put policy on the table to tackle this issue.
Just because it seems a bit counterintuitive to me, what would be scenarios where you vent and flare
but
it's not an emergency. So why would companies still do that?
Yeah. It should be. It should be that way. But again, you know, take an oil well, for example. So if I am a company looking at developing an oil well, and I drill down into the earth, typically when you're finding oil's heavier than gas. Typically, when you are looking for oil, you'll find gas as well. And we call this associated gas. It's associated with the oil. And it's, the, the formation of the oil, you're shooting for this part of the formation, and there's this little bubble of gas sitting on top of that, that you drill through to get to the oil. When you start pulling out hydrocarbons, you will get gas coming out of the well. The oil company hates that gas. They treat that gas as trash. And what most often happens is that gas is flared or vented straight to the atmosphere, because all they want to do is get rid of it, because it's the oil that they're after. And so though that's one of those situations where you need to have proper planning so that there's a pipeline to grab the gas and get the gas somewhere beneficial, or you need to have requirements in some cases for that gas. And they do this in a number of places around the world, where they capture that gas and then they re-inject it back into the ground. If they don't want it, put it back down there. And so that's something that is done in a number of places around the world. But that's just one example of when they would do this, and why.
So now I know that you don't have too much time left, so maybe we can do like a more general outlook and projection of. You mentioned the impact of reducing methane could actually be very substantial with this 0.3 degree reduction. Do you think now that all these policy changes are happening, we are kind of on track for that?
Yeah, I mean, what we've seen thus far, we've seen some really good concrete policies at the national and subnational level, and that stuff's awesome. We still need to see, the full implementation of those policies. Because just having a policy on a piece of paper doesn't mean much until we get full implementation. But with the global methane pledge, that is even higher up. That's a high level political commitment. Heads of state are saying that they're going to do this. That's fantastic. That opens the door for policy change within each of those nations to address methane emissions. And that's just the earliest step in this process. So while we're seeing a whole lot of attention for this issue, we need to keep the momentum going. We need to go from these commitments to action. And so the coming year, 2 years, 3 years really, will be about going from these high level commitments to putting in place policies and implementing those policies at the national and subnational level to start getting the emission reductions that we absolutely have to have. So while the attention that's come to this issue is fantastic, we still have a long ways to go, and we can't rest on our laurels. We must continue to push on this issue so that we get real policy actions that are implemented and start to see the real emission reductions that we need.
Given the Ukrainian war and the big restructurings in the energy market, do you think that could have actually helped in a certain way, because there's so much movement now and like restructuring happening?
Yeah, one of the things that we're trying to capitalize on is that Europe is Europe's in the process of completely renegotiating all of its energy supply contracts for the most part. And there's an opportunity in this space to leverage those negotiations to require um, some basic, methane mitigation and best practices for the gas supplies that Europe's going to secure. Europe has, a very near term, kind of emergency must supply gas for, the coming winter kind of thing. The contracts they're signing, though, are long term contracts. And so um, while European leaders need to make sure that they're supplying the energy that's needed for the very near term, they also need to be looking at, you know, we have leverage here. We have the ability to secure new energy sources and improve the environmental performance of these fuels that we're purchasing through requirements for best practices in methane mitigation. And so that's, I think, the opportunity in this space. It's an area where when Russian gas was, the dominant source of energy flowing into Europe, um, we wanted to try to do that. We wanted to try to get Europe to leverage that, but Russia's power over the European energy system was, significant, and there was significant concern over exercising any sort of pressure on Russia. Since that's kind of flipped around now and they're looking at all sorts of different sources, we see a real opportunity to change the dynamics here, to require methane mitigation as part of these new contracts that they're negotiating. So that's something we're going to be working on, and that is being incorporated into the Repower EU policies that are released today.
Yeah, that's very interesting. As a final question, because you dedicated large portions of your life to battling climate change, so what would you recommend for people that are now kind of getting aware of the topic and feeling the need for action, maybe especially in the younger generations? What would you recommend them to do?
Well, for me, I think that as you start to get into climate change, and the more you get into climate change, there's a real risk of becoming disillusioned because the problem, it seems so daunting. And it doesn't seem like anything's being done. And so for me, the thing that I would hope the younger generation would take is a bit of hope, a bit of promise that there is something we can do, especially in the near term, to start to bend the curve on climate change. I've worked on climate for a long time, and I've gone through, serious bouts of depression where it's just like, oh my God, there's nothing we can do about this.
Yeah.
We're all, we're all doomed. But for me, this issue specifically is one that gives me hope. Human beings need to win occasionally. You see a football team, and I'm a big European football fan, not American football fan. I'm a big football fan. You see teams that lose all the time. It becomes cultural. They lose all the time. They just keep getting relegated and relegated and relegated. It just becomes a cultural thing for their club. They're just a losing team. Humans have to win occasionally or they become disillusioned. And on climate, we have had a whole lot of losses. We haven't been winning on climate. The problem becomes greater every day. The solutions seem harder and harder, and the politics become more difficult. Methane, for me, is that one thing that I just see so much promise and hope in. We can do it. The politics aren't that bad. It's not that expensive. It's very profitable in many cases. And the benefit that we would see from it will happen while we're still alive,
Yeah.
which humans also need. And
Yeah.
so that's the thing that I think is that I would say is don't lose hope. There are things that we can do that will start to bend the curve on climate, and engage and be active on this, because we have a huge opportunity here.
Yeah, for me, the conversations with the Clean Air Task Force with all of you have been an incredible source of hope and insight. So
That's good.
thanks a lot for this great conversation, and the work you're doing. Obviously, it's very important.
No, this was great. Thank you so much for taking time to do this.